Morning, guys. We got to get going right away because, as you see by your handout, we got a lot of information to cover. I've got a real quick announcement before Pastor Tim teaches. When you came in, you got a handout as you were coming in. Last week, we announced a new ministry we have for people who are unemployed. And while that may not directly apply to a lot of you, one thing I know is that every man in here is thinking more about his personal finances than he was a year ago, right? Okay, we've got a ministry we've been doing for years here that focuses on helping you manage your personal finances in a godly way. We've got a video here that I'd like us to watch together.
The scripture from Psalm 24:1 was the one that always impressed me so very much, is that everything belongs to God. It's His, and it's not ours, and He's allowing us to use it. And so it's our job to use it in the best and most responsible way that we can.
So over the course of 18 months, we were able to pay off that $50,000 of debt and become debt-free except for our mortgage. And so now we are attacking that with gazelle intensity.
When it came time that we went through the, ever predictable high-tech layoffs in this area, we had money put away.
And we were able to get rid of $30,000 of debt, and we were able to give $16,000 to the work of the Lord. I mean, that's just a testament to what God can do.
So it really doesn't matter what age you're in or what financial position you're in life. Everybody can benefit, whether you're way in debt or whether you're out of debt, whether you're young or old. It's just got a lot of practical wisdom that can help you manage your finances better.
It would be just an amazing opportunity to start the new year off with Financial Peace University.
Some of you guys may be feeling like through the course of our study so far, you've wanted to be more engaged in setting direction in your family. Maybe in your particular such situation, your wife has handled most of the financial decisions and you're not really sure how to engage in that conversation. Taking a class together, like one of these classes, gives you guys an opportunity to really sit down and talk, and gives you a chance to have a third party just bringing up topics that create a great environment for you to re-engage in this area if you haven't been, or maybe you have been and you've been doing a less than stellar job with it, and you just need to get your finances working in the right direction. All of these people that you heard from are people right here in Austin, people at Hill Country Bible Church that have benefited, and you don't have to be a member of the church to take advantage of these opportunities. We just want people to get what they need and to be able to move forward, and particularly in this area of finances. Now, as we begin our study today, let me just ask you, if you came home from work and you found the tip of a butter knife was bent, and you raised the butter knife up and you said, okay, how did this happen? And your son said, well, Dad, I was trying to tighten a screw, and I bent the end of the butter knife trying to tighten a screw. Most of you would not be too upset about that because you've done that yourself before. I mean, every one of us reached for a screwdriver, couldn't find one, grabbed a butter knife and bent the end of it. We would say that was an experiment that failed. And in every experiment that we have, there's a level of risk and reward. And bending a butter knife to learn a lesson that butter knives don't really work too well when it comes to the needs of a screwdriver, that's an experiment that every one of us have had, every one of our sons is going to have, every one of our grandsons is going to have, every one of our great-grandsons, so we don't get too upset about that. But if you told your son, hey, listen, son, we need to get these cedar trees out of our yard. Here's the axe, here's the shovel. When I'm going to work today. When I come home, what I want you to do is to start hacking these trees down and digging the roots out, getting them out of our yard. And so you come home, and there's a huge dent in the front of the minivan. And you say, how did that dent get there? and your son said, well, I started working with this axe, and I didn't think it was working too well, so I got the minivan, and I started ramming it, thinking, maybe this will work better. Now, you would say, son, risk and reward, that's crazy. What are you thinking? You don't know anything? That's just, you don't take a $20,000 vehicle and use it as a battering ram in the yard. You just don't do that. That's not an experiment worthy of the risk involved. Or, if you came home and you pulled the drawer open and you pulled out the first butter knife and it was bent, and you pulled out the second butter knife and it was bent, and you pulled out the third butter knife and it was bent, and you pulled out the fourth. You said, what happened to the butter knives? Well, I was trying to screw in a screw. And so I used I used them. You say, well, son, didn't you learn after the first one that this doesn't work? Well, I kind of thought it was bending these things, but, I thought maybe one of these will be strong enough to hold up. You say, son, it's not worth it. It doesn't work that way. Anytime you enter into an experiment, you've got to take into consideration the risk and the reward. What happens when a culture decides that they are going to experiment with the most precious commodities they have? The identities of their people, the family system, children. We're going to start a new sociological experiment in how to raise children. Whenever a society takes on a new experiment in humanity, what we have to recognize is that we are going to roll the dice with generations of people. And I would suggest to you that since World War II, we have been in the midst of several colossal experiments with the very most precious things that we have. Our very being, our relationships within marriage, our children. And you have to ask yourself the question, do you think the experiments that we have entered into are really yielding what we desire? Do we see more happiness in our culture today? Do we see more harmony? Do we see more stability? Do we see people kind of growing in their understanding and values of what it means to be men, to be women, to have relationships, to grow up as a child in this culture? You have to ask yourself that question. Now, last week we dove into the book of Genesis and we finished up trying to answer the question, did God from the beginning have a sociological role and responsibility for the man in the way that he wired Adam and placed him in this world, that if Adam will continue to do that, he will provide benefit. And therefore, every man who follows Adam, if he will do what Adam was called to do, he will provide benefit. Now, we didn't even talk about Eve. We'll talk about women in an upcoming lesson. We didn't talk about it. But was there a social construct that God created from the beginning, that the architect of humanity, when he put together marriage, when he put together the family, when he put together the concept of culture arising from the family, was there a divine design that if we decide we're going to experiment by moving away from that divine design, we're going to create a dent in the front of our vehicle, or a drawer full of butter knives that are bent, or a generation of children that are confused and lonely and depressed and disoriented? That's the question at hand. Just because Red Book magazine has a 23-year-old psychology major who did a couple research papers and wrote an article, and your wife picks it up and reads it and says, well, Red Book magazine says this is the new way to raise kids. I mean, let's think about this for a second, gentlemen. Let's think about this. So the question is there a way that God intended for this to happen? We answered the question last week. Absolutely. The whole story of Adam speaks to the fact that God placed him in a role and a responsibility to give leadership in a loving, benevolent, caring way to the family. What happens when men don't do that? Now, there are lots and lots of people in our culture today who say that's outdated, that's old, that's traditional, as if people in the past are all stupid, people in the present are all smart. How many you kind of think that way. That's kind of what you've been taught to think. Technology, modernity, smart, past, traditional, dumb. That's kind of the way our culture operates. I mean, we believe that history started in 1776. Most of the homes that people live in Europe are older than this nation and the rest of the world, but that's kind of us. So in the midst of all that, there have been lots and lots of arguments put forward against the biblical concept of masculinity and against the biblical model of marriage and family. And I would suggest that we're reaping the consequences of that. So anyway, today I'm going to fly through a bunch of material. I could overwhelm you with history, with sociology. In fact, as I went back through this lesson again, I thought, man, there's a lot of stuff here. We can't discuss all this, so we're not going to discuss all this, but I'm going to go really fast through this. There are two basic arguments that are put forward against the model of Genesis. In other words, the concept that God created the world in such a way that Adam as a man had a responsibility, and all men following Adam need to follow in the pattern of a responsibility. Two basic arguments are put forward against that. First of all, the manhood of Genesis is cultural, not transcultural. It was cultural. Therefore, truths presented about men, women, and their roles are time-bound to an ancient culture and not for us today. In essence, the argument is this. The story of Genesis is a Jewish story, an old Jewish story, and it was written to justify the patriarchy in the old Jewish system. It's about them. It has nothing to do with us today. Second argument is this, that the manhood of Genesis is post-fall, not pre-fall. Therefore, the truths presented about men, women, and their roles are the result of sin and should be rejected. In other words, Genesis writes about the world that got messed up by sin, and therefore everything we see about Adam and Eve in that world is tainted by sin. As Christians, we need to rise above that, which means that value would say we start with a clean slate. There's no differences between men and women. Men and women are all the same. There's no roles. There's no responsibilities. That people who love Jesus or people that love God ought to be able to just kind of merge in. There's no need for order. There's no need for structure. There's no need for division of labor. All of that leads to complications. And so let's just all love Jesus and all be good people, and then whatever happens, happens. Okay, that's the second objection. Okay, responses to these objections. First of all, from the New Testament. So, if we look at Genesis, the Old Testament, come to the New Testament, what do we see? We see that man's leadership, or to the question that man's leadership is cultural and time-bound. If it is, why do the writers of the New Testament refer back to Genesis for their authority? In other words, whenever in the New Testament there's a discussion of men's roles and women's roles and marriage, the authority that the writers in the New Testament go to is back to the book of Genesis. So if it's just cultural and time-bound, why do they keep going back there? I'm going to give you a bunch of passages. Write these down. Look them up at home. We don't have time to go through them. Ephesians 5 refers back to the book of Genesis. 1 Corinthians 11 takes us back to Genesis. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 12 go back to Genesis. 1 Peter 3, talking about the relationship between the husband and the wife, goes back to Genesis. Even Jesus, in Matthew 19, when he was talking about the issue of marriage and divorce, where does he go to validate his point of view? He goes back to Genesis chapter 2. In other words, the New Testament looks back to Genesis 1 and 2 as the model for the way life is supposed to be. So it's not a cultural issue, it's a biblical issue. Secondly, that man's leadership is post-fall. You know, it's this big debate of the egalitarian position, but what we looked at last week is that Genesis 1 and 2, which lays out kind of this concept that men have a special responsibility to lead in society, that took place before Genesis 3. Genesis 3 is where the fall happened. In Genesis 1 and 2, Adam is given his social responsibility. So the role of men to take leadership in culture is not something that came as a result of sin. It's something that has been built into the system by God. Now here's what we would say then. If God hardwired men and women to function effectively in these roles, we should be able to look throughout history at the data to ask the question, how did it work or how is it happening? And I want to take you guys through a very, very quick sociological discussion of the observations of culture, and particularly marriage, men and women in history. First of all, from history, what history and society teach us about the atemporal social patterns between men and women. So asking the question, is male leadership something that was just expedient, something that was hardwired, and where did that come from? Let me give you some. Lionel Tiger and Robin Fox, sociologists, representing probably the biggest body of sociology, make this statement. The human being not only will proceed through a definable life cycle, but will also engage in social relationships with predictable categories of people. Our behavioral biogrammar, that's their word, biogrammar, they say, underlines not only how we will act, but how we will interact with others. Therefore, certain universal social structures and patterns between men and women, in their words, are atemporal. In other words, if you look at all societies, and you look at the way men and women relate, you're going to see in all societies that there's a similar pattern. They are not time-bound. They are atemporal, not the result of social conditioning. And in their words, they say certain social structures, characteristics are instead rooted directly in the innate biological endowment of the human species. In other words, as Stephen Clark, sociologist from Yale University, would say, the evidence solidly verifies the existence of differences between men and women that are not only merely the product of cultures or socialization. One might say that a role difference between men and women was created into the human race. So when you look at culture, it's not a matter of we gave boys pop guns and we gave girls Barbies. Look throughout the history of culture, and you're going to see in every setting and in every society there is a clear distinction between the way men operate and the way women operate and the way they relate to each other. That's taking a look at history. So, if you look at these sociological patterns, what are they? I've given them to you on your outline there. What we observe in all times and all places is first of all, sexual division of labor. Within every culture, we see a sexual division of labor. Roy Andrade says it this way, sociologist and anthropologist says it this way. He says, men and women not only tend to perform different activities in every culture, but the men tend to perform particular types of activities, and women tend to perform particular types of other activities, namely the men leading and the women nurturing in their activities. In other words, what he's saying is, if you studied the peoples of China or Nigeria or England or Mexico, or you went to 800 BC or 400 AD or 1100 AD or 1800 AD, every culture, every society, what you're going to find is that there is a sexual division of labor between men and women, and that sexual division of labor primarily has the men leading or giving direction to the culture and the women nurturing or building into the relationships within culture. That is what Stephen Clark and Lionel Tiger call the bioprogramming, or something happened. It would seem to indicate that maybe God created it to be that way, right? Okay, sexual division of labor. Second, complementary roles in the communal and domestic spheres. Complementary roles in the communal and domestic spheres. Men bear primary responsibility for the larger community in every known society. Women bear primary responsibility for the domestic management and rearing of young children. Every known society, past or present, assigns to men the responsibility for the government of the larger groupings within society and assigns to women primary responsibility for the daily maintenance of the household unit and care of younger children. That's a universal principle. Letter C, some form of female subordination to the man. some form of female subordination to the man. Feminist scholar Sherry Ortner says it this way. She says, I would flatly assert that we find women subordinate to men in every known society. The search for a genuine egalitarian, let alone matriarchal culture has proved absolutely fruitless. This subordination is found on two levels. First, females are subordinate to the male governing of the communal structures, the public spheres, which every exercise of overall governmental authority is the domain of males in every known society. Second, females are also customarily subordinate to males on a more personal level within the family structure. You have to ask the question, why? Why is it that way? And are we swimming upstream, trying to go a different direction? Letter D, cultural expressions of gender differences between men and women. In every culture, we see cultural expressions of gender differences between men and women. Essentially, when you look at cultures, you see that there is beyond the normal, natural function a desire on the part of cultures to define men and define women beyond that. For example, women in all cultures tend to dress in a certain way that would be characteristic of women. Men in all cultures dress in a certain way that would be characteristic of men. In other words, the cultures themselves start to honor these differences and maintain them in their customs. There's specific customs for men to participate, specific customs for women to participate in. In other words, cultures throughout history recognize that there's differences and there's roles that fit those differences. Okay? Two important questions. Haven't there been women-led cultures, matriarchies? Haven't there been women-led cultures, matriarchies? By the way, the feminists will tell you this is true. If you go down to the women's study program at the University of Texas and you go in there and ask them, have there been cultures that are predominantly matriarchy, they will tell you yes. I wish I had an hour today because I could walk you through the data. That is patently false. The concept of Amazon women ruling a culture is patently false. Some of it had to do with some bad scholarship and some terminology back in the days of the early anthropologists as they wrote their stuff. But credible scholarship today will tell you that is patently false. And I've got it all here. I wish I had time, but I don't. Okay. Secondly, couldn't there be a 50-50 culture where men and women do everything the same? Isn't that the ideal? Isn't that what we're shooting for, the totally egalitarian culture? Couldn't there be a 50-50 culture where there was no such thing as maleness, no such thing as femaleness, no such thing as roles, no such thing as distinctions? Is that possible? Well, interestingly enough, in some of our lifetimes, because some of us have a little gray hair here, in some of our lifetimes, we've actually seen this experimented with on two amazing levels. One, by a whole nation of people, and the other by a group of people within a small communal setting. The first one I'm talking about on a national level is communism. Communism. Now let's think about the tenets of communism. In the former Soviet Union, as communism was conceived, they set out to develop a complete egalitarian society. That was their goal. Now think about it. They first of all, they jettisoned a belief in God. In other words, anything that would trace the roots of marriage, of male hierarchy, and all that kind of stuff back to the Bible was completely gone. All the religious concepts were taken out of society. Second, they created paths for women that were unparalleled in history. Women had access to education. So a woman had a clear path to a PhD under the Soviet system, and many of them achieved really high levels of education. In addition to that, women had the opportunity, according to the law, to hold any position. Divorce was granted for no reason whatsoever. Anybody that wanted a divorce could get a divorce. That was fine within the Soviet system. In addition to that, they created a massive state daycare system so no woman would ever feel held back because she had to take care of a child. Massive daycare system. In addition to that, they made abortion on demand the normal method of birth control. to such a degree that the average Russian woman had 5 abortions in her lifetime. So there was no such thing as a woman being held back by her biology from being able to achieve these things. So in a society where they went in and essentially legislated equality, took away all the obstacles for women to give women a complete opportunity, what took place? When the wall came down, when the Iron Curtain was busted, what did we see? We saw one of the greatest examples of male patriarchy in the history of the world. How many women held seats in the Politburo? Precious few. How many women were generals in the Soviet military? You got fingers and toes? I don't think you'll need many of them. How many women were giving any kind of leadership whatsoever? Instead, what we saw was there were 2 classes of men. Those who ran things and those who, Soviet symbol for Boris Yeltsin, too much vodka, drunks. That's what we saw when the curtain came down. It was a total failed experiment. You say, well, they also had a lot of other problems. Well, of course, we're not Russians, we're Americans, and they were our enemies, so obviously we need to dismiss them, and let's just move on to a better scenario. Does anybody recall the concept of the Israeli kibbutz? The Israeli kibbutz. Some of you may have studied that, particularly if you studied psychology or sociology. The Israeli kibbutz was based on a model that we are going to create a communal system. And the communal system meant that the community would serve the role of the family. Men and women would still get married, but they would live in a compound where child care was shared, where education was shared, where government was shared. It was basically the community didn't have a strong sense of leadership. The community got together and decided together. Everybody was considered equal in the kibbutz. And so a woman was not required to take care of her own kids. In fact, oftentimes her own kids didn't even live in the same house with her. She had the freedom to be a doctor. She had the freedom to be a lawyer. She had the freedom to do whatever she wanted to do. She could sit at the council, make decisions, give direction. You know what happened in that culture, in those cultures? They eventually began to fail. You know why? Because the women decided that they did not want to do that. Many of the women decided that if being a doctor 60 hours a week means that somebody else is going to be with my kids all the time and I'm never going to see my kids, I would rather be a teacher or even a daycare worker so I could spend time with my kids. The women decided that they wanted to have more children, not less children. And so that created a huge financial and economic burden on the overall kibbutz because they were beginning to grow. Women wanted to bring the family together and have more of a sense of their own nuclear family than the communal family. And over time, women started to take on the roles that would have less leadership, forcing the men, and it was primarily a female-led demise, forcing the men to have to step up and give direction to the overall, because the women showed less and less interest in seeing the total picture and more focus on the family. And the kibbutz was a second attempt to create a culture where there were no distinctions, no roles, no responsibilities, and it failed because there was something innate within the men and within the women that were there that just made it clear that that wasn't their desires and that wasn't going to work. So, as we look at these things, we have some summaries from Genesis to apply. And next week, we're going to move on to a definition of manhood, but let me try to wrap up kind of what we've been talking about here. First of all, letter A, men were created by God to be spiritual and social leaders. When men abandon their created role or are taught and talked out of their created role by aberrant socializing, chaos ensues. Men were created by God to be spiritual and social leaders. When men abandon their created role or are taught and talked out of their created role by aberrant socializing, chaos ensues. The great feminist anthropologist Margaret Mead said the single greatest question that every culture, every society has to answer is, what are we going to do with the men? Because in every society throughout history, study the history of society, what you're going to find is that for some reason God has hardwired into men this extreme, kind of aggressive, I don't know if it's testosterone, but this need to either be a contributing factor rising to the best and the brightest of what takes place socially, to try to lead people to do great things, to be heroes, or to be villains, to be self-oriented, to use their masculine power to get what they want, to be passive, to be lazy, to be self-focused. That's the tendency that we see in society between men. And whenever men move out of the role of saying, it's my job here to protect society, to love women, to honor the values and the principles of good relationships, it's my job here to give my life, to be sacrificial, to die for the good of other people. When men jettison that, you begin to see the demise of culture. Let me give you a biblical example. In Isaiah chapter 3, starting in verse 1, very, very interesting. Now, this is the time when Isaiah is predicting the downfall of the city of Jerusalem. So this is kind of the end of culture. And he says in chapter 3, verse 1, he says, "See now, the Lord Almighty is about to take from Jerusalem and Judah both supply and support." The word supply there refers to provisions, what we need to live on. Support there refers to men. Men in their role of giving leadership. So this is judgment on a culture. We're going to lose our economic prosperity, and we're going to lose the men. It's interesting that those are the two categories. He says all supplies of food and all supplies of water. And then he talks about support. The hero and warrior, the judge and prophet, the soothsayer and elder, the captain of 50 and man of rank, the counselor, skilled craftsman, and clever enchanter. I will make boys their officials. Mere children will govern them. People will oppress each other, man against man, neighbor against neighbor. What's he talking about? He's talking about anarchy. The young will rise up against the old. What's he talking about? He's talking about youth rebellion, a rebellion against wisdom, and base against the honorable. A man will seize one of his brothers at his father's home and say, "You have a cloak, you be our leader. Take charge of this heap of ruins." In other words, it's not a value-driven leadership. It's like, do you have anything? Maybe like this one guy, he's got a $150 San Francisco 49ers jacket and a $150 pair of Air Jordans. Let's make him our leader. It's the gang mentality, the gang culture. Like, you don't have to have anything. You just have to look a little different, a little bigger, a little more wealthy than everybody else, and we'll put you in charge because nobody's in charge. It's anarchy. He goes on to say, "But in that day he will cry out, I have no remedy, I have no food or clothing in my house. Do not make me the leader of the people. Jerusalem staggers, Judah is falling. Their words and deeds are against the Lord, defying his glorious presence. The look on their faces testifies against them. They parade their sins like Sodom. They do not hide it. Watch them. They have brought disaster upon themselves. Tell the righteous it will be well with them, for they will enjoy the fruit of their deeds. But woe to the wicked, disaster is upon them. They will be paid back for what their hands have done. Youths oppress my people. Women rule over them. O my people, your guides lead you astray. They turn you from the path." What happens in the demise of a culture is the noble roles for men begin to disappear. And boys are basically told, all your job is in life is self-indulgence. Play those video games and let mama take care of you. And when you get to be a man, Your goal is to play whatever games you play then and let your wife take care of you. And that's the demise of a culture. So, moving from that, letter B, the leadership that Genesis tells us, this leadership is carried out with specific responsibilities. So if we're going to look at what the Bible says for men, we've got specific responsibilities that we are supposed to carry out. The first one is a will to obey. A will to obey. What we're saying that is a real man is not an independent man. A real man is under the authority of someone else. A real man is under the authority of someone else. What happens when you have someone who's totally independent in a role of leadership? You have a Bernie Madoff, unaccountable, given into their own desires. When we say you need to take responsibility for leadership, that doesn't mean that you simply decide what you want and you force that on everybody else. That is a made-up construct of what leadership is. True leadership is recognizing that I'm under authority. I've got a will to follow, and that will is the will of Jesus Christ, the will of God. My responsibility is to do for my family and for society what God has deemed is right and righteous and good for them. A will to do. Secondly is a will to obey. Secondly is a work to do. It's a work to do. As a man, I have a responsibility of a work to do. Now, we're not just talking about occupation, though it is our responsibility as men to provide for our families, make sure their needs are met. What we're talking about here is doing the work of accomplishing God's purpose. Doing the work of accomplishing God's purpose. God said to Adam, I'm placing you here in my image. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Subdue it, rule over it, create civilization. Be a father, be a husband, build society, build values. That's your work, guys. And we've been given a work to do. And finally, a woman to love and lead. We've been given a woman to love and lead. Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. It's your job to love the woman in your life and to lead her. Now, if you're here and you're single, you can't just randomly go up to a woman and say, because I'm a man, I have a woman to lead, and so I picked you. So I'm going to start leading you and telling you, here's the direction for your life. If you decide to do that, young men or old men or wherever you find yourself, you better follow that up with flowers and chocolates and a ring and a proposal, okay? We're not talking about men in general finding women and telling them what to do. Don't go in your office today and say, listen, you're a woman, I'm a man. Let me tell you, here's what you're going to do. I'm leading you now. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about within the domestic responsibility of marriage, it's the husband's responsibility to love his wife and to lead his wife, which is exactly opposite of what we saw with Adam in the garden, where Adam should have stepped up, picked up the hoe, cut the head off the serpent, and said, Eve, Adam's standing back passively. And because Adam failed to lead, he plunged his wife into personal, social, catastrophic sin. And it devastated her. Who would have ever thought that the result of Eve eating that fruit would mean that one day she would be burying her second son, who was killed at the hands of her first son? You talk about pain. And his job was to present her like Jesus does his bride, holy and blameless. Could Adam do that? That's what true leadership is about in the home. Men loving and leading your wives, presenting her holy and blameless. We've got the opposite view in our society. We have the view that it's a woman's job to domesticate the men. Boys will be boys. He's going to sow his wild oats. He needs to get him a good woman because she can tame him. She can socialize him. That is exactly opposite of the vision of manhood presented in Scripture. It's so opposite of that. The vision of manhood presented in Scripture is men taking responsibility. Guys who have daughters. Whose job is it to keep your daughter pure when he takes her out on a date? And you know what's happening? You're worried. So you're teaching your daughter, hey, watch out for this, watch out for that, because you know what all men want. And he's going to try this and he's going to try that. You know that? Because that's the vision of masculinity in our culture today. Men screw around. Men don't care about women. Men are in this for themselves. And the biblical model is exactly the opposite of that. It's exactly the opposite of that. The guy is supposed to present the woman pure, not to take her purity away. And we live in a world that does not get that. And if we don't give our boys a vision of masculinity that says it's your job to protect her, it's your job to present her back to her dad in the same state that she left with you in, or nicer, better, you failed as a boy. You failed as a man. You see, that's the biblical calling. We've come a long way from that, haven't we? We're rolling the dice and wondering, like, what's going to happen? And we're starting to see the result of that. The fall of man corrupted man's social and spiritual leadership. He drifted into one of these directions. Here's what every man has the opportunity to drift in because of sin. You can become passive and negligent. Like Adam, stand by and do nothing. Oh, well, that's what all the teenagers are doing nowadays. That's what all the women are doing. That's what all the men are doing. Secondly, you can become selfish and dominant. That's the position that I'm the man and you will do what I say and it's all about me and this world is about me and I'm going to make you bend to my will. You can become dominant. Or you can become abusive and dangerous. You can become abusive and dangerous. And there are more ways to abuse the family than simply physical violence. You can abuse the family by not managing your financial resources and plunging the family into bankruptcy. You can abuse the family by having an affair with a woman and devastating your wife and hurting the family. You can abuse the family by being neglectful and ignoring your responsibilities. There are lots of ways to do that. Letter D, spiritual redemption and courageous obedience to Jesus are required to reclaim one's masculine identity lost in the fall. Guys, we can't do this by ourselves. We need help. There's not a teenage boy alive out there that's going to do a great job of taking care of the women in his world if he doesn't have supernatural help. Both a dad that builds into him and then a God that he can rely on. We need help. That's part of why we're going to complete a masculine plan. We need a plan for how we're going to execute this. That's why we need small groups, because we need each other to keep reminding each other of these things. I need it. You guys need it. We need to be redeemed. We need Jesus, and we need courageous obedience. Letter E, without rebirth in male leadership, our society will follow the ways of other empires. It's predictable. It will follow the way of other empires. And we've studied other empires. We've looked at the world. That's what sociologists do. They study history and they make connections of what takes place in the society. 1947, Carl Zimmerman wrote a book. I finally found a copy. Maybe the last copy standing. It was from a library. It was discarded. I finally found a copy of the book. 1947. Here's what Carl Zimmerman, he's a sociologist. He said this. He said, I'll bet you that if I follow the pattern of a family, like if I look at the social pattern of family in any culture, I can mark whether that culture is going up or whether it's going down. And so he studied the Greek and Roman cultures. And he came to the conclusion that when you look at the family system, like how do families work, that there are three predictable patterns of the family in the development and the decline of a culture. And so if you can trace where the family is, take a snapshot of where the family is, you can kind of see where the culture is. Now, this is prophetic, okay? He was writing in 1947. And I want to give you these really quickly. So, types of families. He said that at the beginning of the establishment of a society, he called the first type of family structure the trustee, where the father was very authoritarian. In other words, there's a frontier to be conquered, there are battles to be fought, there are cities to be built, and men in those cultures tend to rule with a rod of iron. But you see that because there's danger, there's risk, and so the men in those cultures tend to control the family, to make rules, to set the direction, because the risk is really high. Once a culture is established, the wars are starting to subside. We got food and we got water, we got buildings, we got industry. The next phase of family life he called the domestic family. And here, the man became a servant leader. And his job was to teach values to his kids. His job was to build the social structures. His job was to support the family, to build the religious structures. This was a time when the family flourished the most as a servant leader. But as a society becomes economically prosperous, the family moved to the form of family he called the atomistic family, where roles were discarded. People pursued their personal desires. Men began to say, hey, I got plenty of money. I'm not worried about an army conquering me. We've been doing this for too long. It's time for me to have fun. Why do I need to carry all this social responsibility? Women follow suit. Hey, if the husband gets to play, I get to play. And the society begins to decline. And he said, you look at every society, and if you can tell by the way the family's going, like what the men's role is in the family, you can follow society. So he said that there are 8 signs of a culture's imminent demise. 8 signs of a culture's imminent demise. Let me give them to you real quick. See if these sound familiar to you. Marriage loses its sacredness and is frequently broken by divorce. Marriage loses its sacredness and is frequently broken by divorce. Number 2, the traditional meaning of the marriage ceremony is lost. Alternate forms of marriage arise and individual marriage contracts supplant traditional agreements. Anybody remember why brides wear white dresses? Anybody remember what that was supposed to stand for? Like, be more specific. Like, she hadn't had intercourse with anybody, right? She's a virgin. Like, we have women after their 3rd marriage and got teenage kids are wearing white. Like, doesn't mean anything, does it? Because it's not important in our culture anymore. Oh, man, that's another topic. Letter C. Feminist movements abound. Women lose their inclination for childbearing and child rearing. If we think that feminism is a new development, it's only a new development in our culture. It's been going on in various cultures throughout the history of the world. Letter D, there is a growing disrespect of parental authority and for authority in general. Teenage rebellion, disrespect for the government, disrespect for authority. Hey, and by the way, guys, listen. If your kids do not have someone in their life who presents positive authority, why would we think that they would respect authority? Like, if the best we can come up with is, son, you need to do good on your schoolwork, we're not really presenting a vision that they would want to follow. Like, when your kids are rebelling against your authority, ask yourself the question, like, what does my authority look like? Get the mirror and hold it up and say, what are the messages that my kids hear from me? Is it, don't bug me, get out of my way, don't cause any problems, I don't want to have to go down to that school, I don't want to have to pay attention to your homework, I don't want to have to spend any more money on you. When I talk to you, I want you to be nice to me. Is that as good as it gets? What's out there for them? What are we presenting to them? Letter E, there's an increase in juvenile delinquency, promiscuity, and rebellion. This was 1947, based on the Greeks and the Roman Empire. Letter F, members of traditional marriages refuse to accept family responsibilities. So the last one was delinquency, promiscuity, and rebellion. This one is members of traditional marriages refuse to accept family responsibilities. Letter G, there is an increasing desire for and acceptance of adultery. Increasing desire for and acceptance of adultery. And then letter H, there is a greater tolerance for perversions of all kinds, especially homosexuality. Now, in 1947, studying the Greek and Roman culture and then the rest of cultures up through society, watching the rise and the fall of those cultures, Carl Zimmerman said, here's what we noted when society's reached its apex and it starts to change and it starts to come down on the other side. So I bring you back to the question. Guys, how many butter knives are in the drawer? Like, how many times can we keep experimenting with a new family model, new role for men, new role for women, a new way to do this? How many times can we do this? And at what cost? At what cost? To our kids, to our future, to our culture, to our society, to our world. Let me pray for you. Father in heaven, oftentimes when we start thinking about the overall tone of where we are, it kind of seems overwhelming, like what can I do? And then I start looking at myself and realize that I'm probably as great a contributor to the problem as I am a victim of the problem. And I pray for myself, I pray for these guys. May we get up in the morning with a desire to be that kind of man who loves and leads and walks in purity according to your will. And may you help us to create a community of men right here that can support that with one another and with our kids. For we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.